bartender was unveiled. The robot can talk and take spoken orders and can mix 200 different drinks. But on the first test run, the robot knocked a glass off the bar and onto the floor and poured beer all over the counter. The robot's designer said there were still some bugs to be worked out.
U.S. retaliation, nuclear war, nuclear war.
In Japan, where high technology is showcased, consumers stare in wonder at the latest facet of life overtaken by the computer age, the department store. But while the Cebu store is proud of its technology, it is worried that customers will feel it has lost the human touch.
Okay, and we're live. Georgi Dinkov, Ray Peat. Georgi, I won't interrupt. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, there was I saw a study. It was published in 2004. It was a bodybuilder in Portugal, and he went to the hospital for some reason, and the doctors there tested, give him some blood tests, and he admitted to taking steroids. But when he showed the doctors the vials that he'd been using, the amount of steroid in the vials was really small. Yet he was having these. Surprisingly, he had huge muscles, and they tested for other chemicals, and he denied taking anything else. So they said, "Well, is that the only thing you've been taking?" He said, "Yeah, I've been only taking that steroid, and every time I take the steroid, I'm also taking 200 milligrams of caffeine." So they said, maybe the caffeine is somehow promoting the effects of the steroid. And then they tested in vitro the dihydrotestosterone with caffeine, and caffeine increased the transcription effects through the androgen receptor by 300 to 400%. So they concluded that caffeine somehow increases the effects of the anabolic steroids, at least of androgens like dihydrotestosterone. So I thought the same thing may be happening with thyroid.
Yeah, one of the good things that the favorable steroids do, progesterone, the androgens in particular, is to stabilize the cell in such a way that it can expel calcium and sodium, get rid of the short circuit of the energy process, suppress glycolysis, and move into the oxidizing state. And caffeine works probably analogously to the steroids and carbon dioxide, a structural electron of attracting effect that they all have in common.
Have you seen some of the older studies from the 50s and 60s showing that they administered some kind of a vitamin D analog that was really good at calcifying soft tissue? I think it's called dihydrotachisterol. And then they showed that androgens can actually decalcify the cell, like testosterone, progesterone can get the calcium outside of the cell.
Yeah, caffeine does the same thing. I think that's the basis for caffeine's protective effect on the liver against fatty liver and fibrosis of the liver and carcinogenesis, all kinds of cancer-causing processes are blocked by caffeine, whether it's radiation or chemical carcinogens or even viral processes. All of those are pro-inflammatory, pro-glycolytic, reductive processes. Caffeine is like progesterone, supporting the oxidizing structures.
Do you think caffeine has some effects similar to sodium, like it's perceived by the cell as a mild irritant, so the cell ramps up its metabolism in response to being exposed to caffeine?
Yeah, that would account for the stimulating effect, but at the same time, it has the calming in a bigger sense, stopping the dangerous types of excitation while letting the cell respond to adrenaline.
Do you think there's a certain amount of caffeine daily that's optimal? In other words, because I saw some studies saying that anything more than three cups of coffee a day, they only looked at liver disease and I think osteoporosis, but they said anything more than 3 cups didn't really increase the benefit. These were all epidemiological studies. So I'm wondering if there is an optimal amount.
Most of the best studies that I've seen found 5 cups a day. The benefit was still increasing, and the population, they said 5 or more cups per day, for example, had the least liver disease and least dementia, and in some studies, the least cancer. So I think it depends on your need, and in some people it might go up to maybe 50 cups a day. When I was hypothyroid, I felt best when I would have 30 to 50 cups, just constantly drinking fairly strong coffee with cream.
Wow! So you were drinking more coffee than milk at that time?
No, I drank a lot of milk too, but generally not together. And interestingly, I didn't form a tremendous amount of urine because I evaporated so much. At that time, I would steam up even a fairly big room full of windows in cool weather.
What would be a good sign that the person is getting their metabolism too high and getting a bit dehydrated? Because I know that if you drink very sugary drinks, and you evaporate a lot of water, it can increase the blood osmolarity. But what would be a good, I don't know, like maybe urine color or viscosity, or I guess, is there anything else that can be used to test?
Yeah. If your urine starts getting very dark and thick, you should take more fluid.
Okay.
It doesn't hurt to pour excess water through. Sometimes in hot weather, when I would drink gallons and gallons, I might make maybe 2 quarts of urine, depending on the heat and activity. Sometimes I could evaporate 2 or 3 gallons out my lungs and skin.
But in cold weather, it's probably a little bit better to be on the high osmolarity side, right?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Okay, kind of the theme of this show, it goes along with what we were just talking about. But last time we talked about kind of turning food into electrons, passing them through the cell, making carbon dioxide, ATP, water. And so I thought this week we could talk about carbon dioxide, Ray, and the calcium, potassium, magnesium, sodium regulation? Because I know that's like a central theme in a lot of your work. And so I think we had this conversation probably like 2 years ago, but I was just too stupid to have it with you. So we have Georgie here, and so he could fill in the gaps. But yeah, maybe starting from wherever you see as the most pertinent, but the regulation of those ions, and then what happens when they're too much of the calcium and sodium go inside the cell, and when too much of the potassium and magnesium is lost, or wherever you think is good to start.
You can start almost anywhere and end up the same place. Things that support oxidation, like thyroid hormone, are acting largely through forming carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide, one of its major functions is in proportion to its increase, it suppresses the formation of lactic acid as the alternative low energy form of metabolism. And the low energy goes with letting large amounts of calcium and sodium accumulate in cells, leading to eventually chronic structural changes. So keeping your CO2 up steadily and on average year after year after year gradually prevents the structural changes, so that keeping yourself in the CO2 thyroid responsive state doesn't get harder with aging. If you slip back periodically, going out of the carbon dioxide state tends to allow, for example, collagen to increase, and lipofuscin and other esters of cholesterol with polyunsaturated fats and other things increase sort of as harmful baggage that builds up with age. So just steadily keeping your energy up day after day has the long-range protective effect of not letting those things accumulate so fast.
Well, maybe I think it was maybe our last conversation. I listened to it again, but you were saying the calcium, whether it was sedative or excitatory, depended on carbon dioxide, and so
yeah.
Go ahead.
The CO2, one of its actions in the bloodstream is to form compounds, not exactly calcium bicarbonate, but complex ionic compounds, keeping calcium in an ionized state. And when it's in this ionized water-soluble state, it isn't in a state that has an affinity for cells. So if you just, for whatever reason, like hyperventilating, if you hyperventilate for a minute or two, you'll notice that your fingers and hands and feet tend to cramp up. Losing the calcium outside of cells in the water-soluble state, it along with other changes happening with the loss of carbon dioxide, the calcium goes into cells instead of being held outside by the CO2. So the absence of CO2 in the cell in itself makes the cell gain an affinity for calcium, and the lack of CO2 in the bloodstream and extracellular fluid will cause the calcium itself to go into a form that has an affinity for inside the cell.
Isn't the mechanism for entering the cell by calcium binding with ADP? When ATP levels drop but ADP levels rise, calcium has an affinity for ADP, and that's what's getting it inside the cell, or at least keeping it there?
ATP binds magnesium, so that most of the magnesium in the cell is attached to the ATP molecule. And with a lower energy state, less thyroid and less CO2, the ATP isn't reformed as fast, so you have more ADP, which binds calcium, and so that's part of the cell increasing its affinity for calcium at the same time that calcium is losing its affinity for the blood solution.
So if you're not producing enough CO2, there's nothing to take calcium outside of the cell as well, right?
Calcium or CO2 effectively by streaming as it's formed, it's constantly streaming from the mitochondria into the extracellular fluid, and that tends to drag with it the mobile ions, calcium and sodium. So they're being mobilized by the moving stream of carbon dioxide. And when you lack carbon dioxide, the formation of lactic acid takes over. And lactic acid has the same destabilizing effects that calcium does, or lack of oxygen or lack of thyroid. The lactic acid shifts the oxidative reductive ratio of everything in the cell, so that all of the components lose their electron affinity to a small degree. And so the cell, to some extent, loses its interactive affinity for carbon dioxide and progesterone. And so those become less effective if you're producing lots of lactic acid and letting the cell get into its more reducing state. Tends to be a higher pH, which causes the cell to take up more water. And the lactic acid itself is, to some extent, a chelator of calcium. And it turns out that probably the best explanation for calcification of the arteries and other soft tissues is that lactic acid goes into the blood vessel or other cell at an abnormal concentration, along with increased calcium, and together the chelated calcium and lactate combination with phosphate that tends to form permanent crystallization inside the cell. But that sort of thing happens everywhere. It's just most visible in the blood vessels because they're constantly exposed to the lactic acid formation by the endothelium and red blood cells, as well as what's happening in the tissues.
I saw two studies recently showing that that blood vessel calcification can be directly triggered by cortisol and aldosterone. Do you think those effects of these two steroids are mostly due to the fact that they interfere with the cell's oxidative metabolism and increase the production of lactic acid?
Yep. Block the energy. Aldosterone and cortisol both directly interfere with mitochondrial oxygen use.
Ray, do you see the intracellular calcium? Is that like a signal or a message to slow down the system, or is it like a biological screw up? How do you interpret that event?
In one situation, it's a challenge to adapt to, and so it can be a growth and development signal that accounts for our particular shape. But that same process, when we are no longer evolving fast enough to invent something new to do with it, then you start getting the effect in which it makes tissues stay too long in the excited state. It gets harder and harder to rouse your oxidative resources to relax the tissues and squeeze the calcium out and stop the lactate production.
I have a question. If there isn't enough ATP to bind the magnesium, my guess is that magnesium will simply flow out of the cell, right?
Yeah, apparently that's what happens when your thyroid is low.
So the medical test, if you go to the doctor, they'll say, "Oh, let me test your blood magnesium." Well, maybe magnesium in the blood shouldn't be high. That wouldn't necessarily be a good sign, right? Since it's an intracellular mineral.
Yeah, exactly like potassium. High potassium often means that your cells are dying and letting their potassium leak into the bloodstream. Same with magnesium.
Do you think there's any good blood test for intracellular magnesium? I saw some kind of a company advertising erythrocyte magnesium test. Would that be a good one?
Except that erythrocytes are mainly glycolytic in their energy system. So they aren't very representative of the oxidative cells, but it's undoubtedly better than just the dissolved magnesium.
What about hair and nail test for magnesium?
The nails are probably pretty good, but hair is exposed to the air and any water that you get on your hair, and dust and fumes bind strongly to the hair. So hair is a terrible way to get an impression of what's happening in your body.
But nails will be better, and for things like steroids, maybe.
Yeah, especially toenails, where they're relatively shielded if you wear shoes all the time.
Okay.
Ray, you mentioned the intracellular calcium being excitatory, but also in your what's this newsletter called? Fats, Functions, and Malfunctions newsletter. You quoted an article what said that DHA and arachidonic acid brought the cells to a new steady state of moderately elevated intracellular calcium level, where the cells became virtually insensitive to external stimuli. This new steady state can be considered a mechanism of self-protection. And so, can you expand on that? And then I thought it's kind of interesting, like as the cells are becoming insensitive to stimuli, and then you could probably draw like a direct correlation between the person becoming insensitive to stimuli, and I don't know if there's a connection there.
I think so. Probably the long range thing is the cholesterol PUFA ester that interferes with the proper stabilizing functions of cholesterol, and so in a way it's keeping the cell in an activated condition that lets calcium remain too long, and in that semi-activated condition, you just don't have as far to move. In effect, if you're already half contracted, then it takes a giant stimulus to get you to contract the rest of the way. The readiness to contract is a very high structural energy storage effect. ATP and proteins in a hydrophobic state, when they get just a sufficient trigger, will undergo a huge activation with contraction if they're a muscle cell, but with a powerful conduction if they're a nerve cell. But if they're in already a half-activated state, the triggering mechanism is already half spent, and so it takes something different to get the residual, the mostly glycolizing cell to become functional and active.
Have you seen recently a study came out? It was on patients with COVID-19, and I was surprised to see the doctor there said that, as if it was common knowledge, that apparently calcium and albumin can bind and directly deactivate endotoxin. Is that a specific property of calcium, or do all of like sodium, potassium, and magnesium also have this property?
I don't know. I haven't seen that.
Okay.
Another example of an excited state that loses sensitivity would be cancer cells. They have the inability to relax, so they're always acting as if they're being powerfully stimulated, and that makes them blind to the things that should be stimulating them and guiding their functions.
What's the differentiator between if a cell becomes like overexcited and shifts into the proliferative stage versus becoming, I think you might have described it already, but not being sensitive to it? Is it an age of the cell type of thing, or what?
Probably a lot of things acting on whether the mitochondria can activate the cell dissolution process of apoptosis, in which the cell activates the right proteolytic enzymes and dehydrates and harmlessly deconstructs into particles that can be phagocytized. That takes a certain amount of energy and residual resources to get things to die in an organized way. And when a cell is beyond that state of responding to stress with a neat dissolution, making way for replacement cells, then you get either a nasty inflammatory lingering death that poisons its environment in all directions, or it becomes a deranged, at best a scar tissue or keloid sort of cell, at worst a tumor cell.
I wanted to go back a little bit to the speaking about the cancer cells being overexcited. I'm sure you've seen there's some older studies showing that the giving animals with cancer GABA drugs like the benzodiazepines was highly therapeutic. How is GABA? I mean, we know that GABA is an inhibitory system. How does GABA act on the calcium in the cell, if at all? Do you think it somehow gets the excess calcium out of the cell, and that's what allows it to calm the cells down?
I've always assumed that, but it just occurred to me that one of the functions might be to activate the calcium binding system, calbindin, for example. That's an alternative to getting it out of the cell. And I hadn't thought about whether GABA can activate that process. But yeah, that's the basic thing, that the GABA gets rid of the sodium and calcium excess.
Okay. And another interesting study, again, old, because these things don't seem to be interesting to doctors these days, showed that infusions into animals with cancer of the magnesium salt of ATP, so magnesium bound to ATP, quickly made their tumors go away over a period of just 6 to 7 hours. Do you think that's the energetic supply of ATP and magnesium was, the signal that allowed the cell to get rid of its extra calcium and calm down?
Yeah, I think so. The compound with magnesium probably is the right way to use ATP therapeutically, because other forms will break down easily, become external. Free ATP is very dangerous. It's one of the major danger signals or activators of inflammation. But when it's bound to magnesium, it is probably not toxic outside the cell and can get inside the cell easier.
As far as your recommendation to consume a significant amount of calcium daily, aside from calcium lowering parathyroid hormone, and I guess increasing lowering inflammation, and I guess increasing cellular metabolism, what other reasons are for recommending the high calcium diet? Because some people have been emailing me and saying, if somebody is in a state of calcium overload, giving them that extra calcium, wouldn't that make things worse for some people?
No, the harmful calcium overload usually results from high parathyroid hormone, which usually goes with increased aldosterone and other problems. But the overload is intracellular under the influence of the anti-metabolic action of parathyroid hormone. And so vitamin D and calcium act first to knock down parathyroid hormone. The lower, the better, and let the cells return to the self maintaining state. People who have had their parathyroid glands removed surgically for kidney disease often recover from lots of the symptoms of chronic kidney disease. Their sleep improves. They might stop having seizures. A lot of inflammatory things are decreased when they simply cut out the parathyroid glands. But that's because there are poisons being produced mostly in the intestine when the kidneys are failing that drive up the parathyroid hormone. And if your kidneys haven't deteriorated, then taking vitamin D and getting lots of calcium will hold down your parathyroid hormone and let the cells re-energize themselves and get rid of their calcium. And when I talk about vitamin D, I mean the cholecalciferol, definitely not the 1,25 hydroxy or dihydroxy cholecalciferol. That activates the so-called calcium or vitamin D receptor, and those are activated by high parathyroid hormone, and they do the dirty work of the high parathyroid hormone. Turning on lactic acid production is one of their essential actions. Production of lactic acid in the bones is the sometimes useful effect of parathyroid hormone. When you need to draw calcium out of the bones, the parathyroid hormone makes lactic acid locally and dissolves enough calcium to move into the bloodstream. But if you have persistently high parathyroid hormone, then that keeps acting, and you're constantly moving calcium into the bloodstream, and in the presence of the lactic acid being produced everywhere in the body under the influence of the parathyroid hormone, then the calcium gets stuck in all of your tissues.
So 2 questions. So I guess you just explained. So I guess, as you know, most people with cancer, advanced cancer, have this condition called hypercalcemia. That's probably due to the excessive lactic acid, which all tumors produce, and I'm guessing high parathyroid hormone, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I've been thinking for a long time that there should be a regular testing every time a person has a medical blood test. I think they should check the level of lactate in the blood. You can diagnose cancer even if you can't find a tumor. If you have a serious cancer developing somewhere, your blood lactate is going to be increasing, and the lactate becomes carcinogenic to other tissues. So the cancer doesn't necessarily have to metastasize to spread because it's putting out the toxic levels of lactic acid, tending to burn other cells into either cancer or cells that favor the development of cancer.
Just for posterity, where would you want to see the lactic acid? What would it be a healthy amount?
Now they usually say the normal range is 0.05, I think it's millimoles, to 2.2, and already at 2, the mortality is increasing. People with 2 and above, when they come into a hospital, are less likely to get out alive than the people who are well under 2. So I would say maybe 1.0 would be a maximum compatible with health.
Did you see the new studies that came out with COVID patients entering the hospital? The ones that didn't survive, more than 80% already had some level of lactic acidosis before even getting admitted to the hospital?
Yeah, I think the lactic acid is starting with endotoxin. Lactic acid produced under the influence of endotoxin becomes the agent of all of the problem symptoms, blood clotting, increased serotonin effects of all sorts, inflammatory, swelling, congestion, and edema of the lungs and the brain. All of those things are activated by the lactic acid.
In your fats malfunction article, you said that intracellular calcium increases lipolysis. How is that working out? Is there a signal to like the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals to release hormones, or?
No, right inside the cell,
okay.
like in the heart muscle or anywhere that is acting. F.Z. Meyerson had his famous calcium triad, which was the Japanese researcher Fujita concentrated a lot on the ubiquity of calcium intracellular concentration with deterioration and death. But F.C. Meyerson said besides contraction, calcium acts to increase proteolytic enzymes and lipolytic enzymes and nucleic acid degrading enzymes. Those were the three main effects that made calcium deadly under the prolonged influence of stress and lactate.
And then you also say it increases the phospholipases that release arachidonic acid from cells. So this is something that doesn't have to happen. So this is just exclusively bad, right?
Yeah. The prostaglandins are just one of the consequences of lipolysis, sort of random inflammatory lipolysis creates even the lesser than like compounds become toxic when released inappropriately.
In that Fujita paper, he calls the intracellular calcium I think he calls it like the final common path of cell death or something. Is nitric oxide involved in? I don't know if he wrote about it, but is the increase in nitric oxide, is that how it's basically killing the cell?
Yeah. There are a lot of pathways that converge on nitric oxide too. Like on calcium uptake. They all end up lowering oxidative production of energy, blocking CO2 formation.
Okay, so
I have a question about lactate. So let's say there is a buildup of lactate in the body. I've been looking at some, again, older studies showing that methylene blue can directly reoxidize lactate back to pyruvate. Do you know of any other intervention that may help lower it outside of breathing into a paper bag?
The right amount of caffeine helps, but all of the anti-inflammatory things are helpful.
Wouldn't quinones in general help to reoxidize lactate back to pyruvate?
Yeah, I think vitamin K and ubiquinone are part of the defensive process.
I noticed there was a study that was using a low-dose doxycycline because they noticed it had an anti-osteoporotic effect in postmenopausal women. And one of the surprising findings that they had was that these women's lactic acid dropped dramatically. So I thought maybe doxycycline, being a quinone itself, was acting like methylene blue and reoxidizing lactate back to pyruvate.
Yeah, that is very reasonable because some of the flavonoids, like fisetin, just by a slight shift in the electron affinity in the direction of more oxidized retraction of electrons, will have a big effect on stopping lactic acid formation and getting the cell back into the oxidizing condition.
Would things like apigenin and naringenin also have similar effect? Because I've noticed you mentioned these in a few of your articles.
Yeah, I think those are the three most active, but there are several with a similar, not quite as intense pro-oxidative effects. There's a Wikipedia page about natural progesterones, molecules that act like progesterone and exist in nature. They call fisetin, apigenin, and naringenin phytoprogestogens because they activate the progesterone receptor. Really? I've never seen that.
Yeah, if you type in Google phytoprogestogens, immediately the Wikipedia page will come up, and these three are listed there. I was pretty surprised, but they now recommend them as they don't recommend, but they're saying these could be alternatives to women who don't want to take steroidal therapy because these apparently act the same way.
Yep, they're all doing a little bit of the same thing. So there are probably 1,000 favorable things you can do, but medicine hasn't got onto the idea that the organism works as a whole. And so they think of disease and symptom and drug as singular things rather than part of this almost formless interactive whole.
Ray, in our when I talked to you a few years ago, I asked you about prolactin and parathyroid hormone and how they from a layman stance, they seem to have so many parallel functions. Do you think one evolved before the other one? And then you quoted a paper from, I think, a gentleman named Raymond saying that they would tend to follow each other, but occasionally. Go ahead.
Yeah, that has been discussed several times, that at different stages, evolution invents one way to do something, and then as it advances, it invents another way, but it doesn't give up the first invention. And so usually we have 2 or 3 or more ways of doing everything.
What do you make of, like, occasionally I've seen a lab work and the prolactin will come back, I don't know, at 5 or 6, and then the parathyroid hormone will come back at like 40 or 50. Is that just a moment in time that there was a difference in those hormones, and then if you measure it an hour later, it might be radically different?
The different things like thyroid deficiency increasing TSH fairly directly increases prolactin without such a direct effect on parathyroid hormone. But there are many levels of the interaction. The thyrotropin release hormone happens to activate prolactin release. So they vary closely with each other. And cortisol tends to go in the same direction. High cortisol and the parathyroid hormone and prolactin are doing similar things, but each one has its own other regulatory influences. So one can go up without the other, but they tend to be doing the same calcium mobilizing action.
And then, if I'm remembering this right, in one of your, maybe it was your Milk article, you talked about parathyroid hormone related protein, and that being related to, what was it, endotoxin? So the parathyroid hormone and the calcium metabolism has this direct connection to endotoxin. Is that right?
Yeah, just as one of our basic threatening environmental factors, starting the threat to disorganize the cell, making the cell respond.
So because you mentioned parathyroid related peptide or related protein, PTHRP, it's known to be dramatically overproduced in cancer patients. Do you think that's something that cancer cells produce themselves, and that's actually responsible for the hypercalcemia, or is it PTHRP is the elevation is result of endotoxin, and it just happens to be a bystander to cancer as well?
I think both of them happen, but they know that cancer cells usually produce a lot of the parathyroid-related protein.
Okay. What would be the purpose of the cancer cell producing that? To mobilize, to basically get more calcium for itself?
Yeah, apparently.
Okay. So what is the cancer cell trying to get to? Because if we assume that the cancer is not trying to kill us, it's simply a sign of a deranged metabolism or a bad environment. What is the end goal of the cancer cell? It's trying desperately to survive, or what is it? Why does it need more calcium?
what it really needs is something to ionize the calcium and get rid of it. But I don't know whether there would be an actual survival function. It's possible that it's just actually too disorganized to have any survival meaning.
Okay. But in one of your articles, you mentioned that cancer cells have such hunger for polyunsaturated fats that they can get quickly overloaded with them and die. Maybe the same thing may be happening with calcium. There's just a desperate attempt to, I don't know, to trigger apoptosis, right? If they get overloaded with calcium.
Yeah, that's a reasonable thought.
A few more questions, then we can move on to politics. But Ray, I think something I've heard very frequently is Ray's emphasis on calcium is misguided because evolutionarily we would have never got that much calcium in our diet. So what is your perspective on that?
Well, eating leaves are very rich in calcium. Relative to the protein in leaves, that's why where milk gets its high concentration of calcium in relation to protein is mainly from the leafy diet. And if fruit is our evolutionary main driving force, the high sugar metabolism allows a low stress metabolism that can use its calcium very efficiently, not wasting it. In experiments with a calcium deficient diet, when they added sucrose, I think it was dogs, the animals that got extra sucrose had stronger bones, even without enough calcium in their diet.
So the idea that we evolved eating gigantic proportions of meat, do you think that's pure fantasy?
Oh yeah, I don't think that's possible because of the effect of a high phosphate to calcium ratio. One of the effects of eating a high fruit diet with sucrose, 50% of sucrose being fructose. Fructose metabolism lowers the redox tendency, lowers the reductive force of the cell, shifts it into the oxidizing state the same way vitamin K and fisetin and so on act on the cell. And so the pattern of cell metabolism when we have enough sucrose is to not let calcium get into its toxic condition, which is favored when the cell is in a high redox state, lactic acid dominated.
Do you think the evidence, I might articulate it wrong, but the isotopes of, and those people say that's evidence for the high meat eating. What do you make of their evidence that they say man evolved eating lots of meat? Just
do you know which isotopes they're talking about?
I shouldn't have done it on the fly. I should have looked up. But they always say there's evidence, physical evidence that man evolved eating lots of meat. But I should have obviously picked up something to say. Okay, last question, unless Georgie has more. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a few. Well, I think first, going back to the meat eating, even carnivores don't eat meat all the time. They hunt. If they successfully kill an animal, they eat, and then they go hungry for a week, 10 days before they manage to hunt another animal. So I don't think humans were capable being much poorer predators than the apex predators. I don't think our ancestors were capable of eating meat every day, and probably not even like once a week. So I'm not buying that either. And I think also I wanted to add to raise or more of a question. Fructose also tends to deplete phosphates in the body, right? Because its metabolism consumes phosphorus.
What metabolism consumes phosphorus?
The conversion of fructose into glucose in the body, I think it consumes phosphorus, right?
Yeah, it lowers the intracellular phosphate at least.
Right. So that should lead to an increase in the calcium to phosphorus ratio.
In effect, yeah.
Okay.
And I think a lot of the big-mouthed carnivores probably ate quite a bit of bone calcium, chewing the small bones.
The reason I'm asking the question about fructose and phosphorus is that somebody sent me a study recently and the study says, don't eat fructose. It's going to lower your energy levels because if fructose metabolism consumes the phosphorus, you will not have enough to synthesize ATP. What would you respond to that argument?
Well, there's an optimal level of ATP, and you never get your phosphate so low that you can't use it to make as much ATP as you need. And an excess of phosphate has not only the calcium binding effect and cell damage, but it has a tendency to keep the cell in the excited state. In itself, it is pro-excitatory. And that burdens the cell and makes it tend towards inefficient, ultimately glycolyzing metabolism. So keeping your phosphate under control, that's the good thing that parathyroid hormone does, is help to excrete phosphate. But the accumulation of phosphate with aging, that's what has made the closo gene so interesting the last 10 or 15 years. The anti-aging protein is mainly a calcium phosphate regulator, preventing those pro-aging effects of too much phosphate.
So the androgens and some steroids, basically getting the calcium out of the cell, that may be done through the activation of the cloto gene, right? It
is connected to all of these other interesting signaling and energy substances.
Have you seen there are a few studies only, there are not that many, that the polycosanols, the very long chain saturated fatty acid alcohols, are also capable of activating cloto?
No, I hadn't seen that, but that effect of a long saturated chain, whether it's alcohol or the tail of a fatty acid, that has a structural calming, stabilizing effect in lots of ways. So it's logical that it would be favoring the clotho.
I'm sure you've noticed, you've heard that a lot of Caribbean countries have a very high number of centenarians per capita, and it's considered, they call it the Caribbean paradox, because they also smoke a lot of cigars and drink a lot of rum. Do you think maybe their high consumption of polycosanols, which are present in sugarcane and many other of the foods, traditional foods eaten there, do you think that may have something to do with their longevity?
There are several good studies in which there's a powerful correlation between saturation of the tissues and longevity. The more PUFA you have, the shorter your life is.
Speaking of evolution, I cannot believe I've never asked you about this, but the Bosca skull and people with those larger head kind of situations. Like, what if you were to speculate? What do you think is going on there? Like, I'm sure it's more than just nutrition, right?
They probably lived up high on Mount Kilimanjaro and grew watermelons.
And watermelons. Like, and when you look at those skulls, like, are there parts like this? Is the cerebral cortex? Is it just it's like getting taller? Like, what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, there a lot of these things we've been talking about increase the foldedness of the cortex. The low energy things tend to give us a flatter, less wrinkled, thinner cortex. And even within an individual lifetime, you can see thickening or thinning of the cortex according to, for example, your progesterone to estrogen ratio, your carbon dioxide to lactate. The cortex is growing all the time, given the energy and conditions, and as it produces more functioning cells, it gets thicker and in effect longer, and has to wrinkled to since the whole the linear or the area of it increases, and on a sphere, that means it has to get more and more wrinkly, and that thickens it, even though the layer in itself is keeping the same structure. The wrinkles get deeper.
Go ahead.
I think that's the thing that can, in a very short time, account for a very big skull like the Boskop.
You mentioned, I think it was our last episode, that the last 130 years of history were fraudulent. Like, if like historians seemingly are completely uninterested in something like the Boskop skull, like what are origins more mysterious and more interesting than a standard history book?
Yeah. All of the history and biological books are written to confirm a paradigm which is radically wrong. If you start with Franz Boas, who was sort of the founder of scientific anthropology, he studied head shape, and had the reason he isn't popular is that he showed what profound effects environment can have on the overall shape of the skull in just a single generation. People with parents coming from the same region of Europe, with the same, in the community in Europe, their heads all had the same ratio of length and width and height. But if they lived in New York or Puerto Rico, their heads changed according to the head shape of the people around them. Obviously, something about the climate and diet in a single generation changed those so-called evolutionary, anthropological, physical characteristics.
Well, I'm not an expert in his work. I know some people will probably laugh, but Graham Hancock, like, what do you think about the ideas that he floats, like Atlantis and things like that? Is there any merit to any of that kind of information?
Probably, considering how doctrinaire and wrong most of the conventional things are, I think it's good to look at anything that is being offered that isn't obviously completely insane.
Well, it's hard to find out what's insane and what's not, because the mainstream information is so often so wrong. And so, Yeah, I mean, is there a person better than Graham that you think has things more figured out?
Anyone that starts with some kind of empirical information that can be checked on or that is well established, then you can check how they reason from that existing information.
Well, one of the structures he was talking about was like Göbekli Tepe or something, and apparently that changed how old we were or something like that. Do you have any additional information on that?
No.
Okay.
Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli
Is that
Tepe.
it?
It's in Turkey. I have a statement and two questions. Speaking of size of the head and the jaw and whatnot, actually, vitamin K at this point has really strong, still anecdotal evidence, as the doctors would say, because there's no study on that yet, that just even smaller amounts, such as like a few milligrams a day, drastically increase the size, the ratio of head to body size, and also they make the jaw wider in a matter of months to just a year. So that immediately invalidates anything about this being set genetically and not changing within a generation or two. Have you noticed any changes in your facial structure from using vitamin K, Ray?
I haven't connected it to anything in particular, but with aging, everyone's head gets wider. And a thing published about 40 years ago on sort of a handbook of aging data showed that with every decade that they had data up to the age of 90, there was a steady increase in the amount of DNA inside the skull. So the head is getting wider, the skull cavity is getting larger, and there's more cells inside the skull.
So just like a rat, we never stop growing for as long as we're alive, right? I think UC Berkeley or somewhere in the Bay Area, Marion Diamond in the 1960s was working with a group studying the effect of environment. An enriched environment caused every generation the rats grew a bigger brain and were more intelligent. And she followed that up with looking at the effect of intrauterine hormone exposure and found that, confirming the work of others, that increased progesterone prenatally radically increased the brain size. Estrogen not only decreased the mass of the brain and the thickness of the cortex, but it even increased the shape of the face, making the jaws bigger in relation to the cranium. So it was like a more mature looking rat. The progesterone produced a bigger cranium in relation to the face, and so a sort of a baby-faced rat, more intelligent looking, but younger looking too. Have you noticed difference in the pictures of Hollywood stars from like the 50s and 60s versus today? They look strikingly different, and to me, the modern stars, quote unquote, are kind of hideous. Have you noticed that change in faces?
Yeah, I think Trump's wives illustrate the stylish change in Hollywood and all of the advertising culture. He has picked out the stylish contemporary women to marry.
Okay. Going back a little bit to the Boskop skull, I noticed some articles that some anthropologists are studying the Indians that live in the Andes mountains in Bolivia and Peru. And one of the things that they noticed that I remember reading, that was maybe about 10 years ago, is two things. First of all, even in very old Indians living up in the mountains, there was no decline in DHEA and testosterone in the males. So those males were just as virile and energetic in their 70s as were men in their late 20s to mid 30s. And another thing they noticed, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and the second thing they noticed more recently was that also the older males had they looked more like children, and their heads were bigger. So I immediately thought of the Boskop skull, and I thought that maybe the same process of living at altitude is not just in Africa, but probably there are many other cultures where we can find such examples if one cares to look for them.
Progesterone is compensating, tends to increase and make up for the reduced oxygen concentration. The progesterone facilitates the delivery of oxygen and sugar to the tissues, and so they tend to have a higher ratio of progesterone to estrogen during pregnancy, which would favor that proportion of the skull. When the Vilcabamba age thing was, I think National Geographic wrote about it in the 1960s, a woman reporter went to interview some of these people who had the church record showing that they were in their 130s or 140s. And she said one of the old guys around 150 hit on her.
Well, speaking of
one more question.
Go.
Again, speaking about longevity, in one of your, I think it was an interview or news that I don't actually it was an interview. You talked about flamingos, that nobody really knows how long they live, but it's the people are now fairly certain that they live past 150. And more importantly, there was no difference in terms of health span. In other words, an older flamingo was just as healthy and energetic as a younger flamingo. Do you know what that could be due to? I guess something in the diet?
I think high salt and calcium. They tend to live in salty lakes. And I think their diet is exaggeratedly overloaded with both calcium and salt.
Is it like the algae that they eat or something? Like from the algae or something, the fish?
And fish. And just when you take a mouthful of fish, you're going to get some of the salty water.
Okay, that's all I had.
Obviously, I want to talk about Trump since you brought him up, right? But I know you've done a lot of work on personality, and when I was reading through Carl Rogers' book, On Becoming a Person, something he said really stuck out to me. I think it's towards the end, and he said, basically to paraphrase, like when he would go through a client-centered therapy session with somebody, they ended up being more, he said, toward becoming a process and not needing the information to be planned out, and they could kind of be more fluid and go with the flow, you know? And I can just read this thing here. He says, the second observation is difficult to make because we do not have a good word for it. Clients seem to be more move toward more openly being a process, a fluidity, a changing. They are not disturbed to find that they are not the same from day to day, and they do not always hold the same feelings toward a given experience or a person, that they are not always consistent. Thinking about that, do you map on a certain hormonal situation to that at all, Ray?
Yeah. All of the things that reduce stress and rigidity, lowering your serotonin, tends to make you less authoritarian and rigid. And so increasing cell energy makes you more flexible mentally. And Margaret Mead, who was Franz Boas's student, in her work, she showed that literacy freezes everything associated with literacy, which tends to be authoritarianism, but the literate cultures tend to freeze and give the impression that cultural change is as slow as biological evolution is supposed to be. And she showed that in the non-literate cultures, as soon as anything changed, requiring a cultural adaptation, they were absolutely flexible and simply intelligently revised their whole culture. So the whole idea of a cultural history being a long-term rigid process, it falsifies what the person is really doing. That they're constantly reinventing culture if they aren't having it drilled into them by authority.
And then like a similar question for Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like you think that I don't know if you subscribe to this concept, but like the self-actualization and then that being associated with wanting to help others and not necessarily caring about what other people think of you. Do you think that is similar hormonal situation of feeling really good?
Yeah, the perception of others right from the beginning, you feel empathy as soon as you recognize that you are in the world. You see how others express their body movements. You feel in your own body when you see them make a gesture or expression, you feel what it feels like on yourself. And so right from the beginning, all of our understanding is empathetic. There is no awareness of the world which isn't also assimilating the empathetic view of others, that you feel their need for justice the same way you feel it for yourself. And that's one of the things that has to be educated out of people, the tendency to feel unity with everyone you know, because you wouldn't have the proper acquisitive behavior. You wouldn't fit into a society in which inequality is a virtue.
Did you know that all doctors, at least in the United States, undergo special training to teach them not to empathize with their patients?
I don't believe it.
Yeah, they do, because I mean the premise that's given is that, look, if you're a doctor and you're treating some pretty sick people and they all start dying, very soon you'll get horribly depressed and commit suicide. Speaking of suicide, did you know that doctors have the highest suicide rate of any profession?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. So, and the second thing is my question, I guess it's a question. Do you think that analytical thought, which is so heavily emphasized and drilled literally into everybody's head since they start going to school, do you think that that process is under the control of serotonin somehow?
Yeah, serotonin creates basically fear and anxiety and withdrawal, and education really is designed to change our organism towards follow the leader, follow instructions kind of behavior.
The reason I'm asking is that it's one of the very common symptoms in people with depression, which we know it's driven by serotonin, is that they tend to overanalyze almost every situation, and they're being taught by their psychiatrist to ignore the inputs from the environment. They're saying, the psychiatrist says, no, you don't need to worry about the world around you. Just, figure out things in your head, because depression is all in your head. And I'm thinking that's exactly the opposite of what the patient should be doing. They should be opening themselves up to the world instead of shutting down, right?
Yeah, the world is constantly there to stream into you with newness. Any contact with the world tends to be exhilarating, and it's only the essentially learned helplessness that makes people turn inward and detach from the environment and its stimulating properties, and particularly other people.
So if we could switch to coronavirus, Georgie, unless you have any other questions.
No, I'm fine.
Okay, can I do a quick summary here? Like, right, when you're talking about the coronavirus increasing angiotensin and hypertensive symptoms and things like that, like the virus itself is real and it has been studied, but like people testing positive is completely a facade. Is that right? Like the numbers and things like that, because there's no accurate test, that is a total, I don't know, chicanery or whatever. Is that right to say or no?
Yeah, they're calling everything that tests on one test or another. If it tests positive, they're calling that a case. But case always has meant a case of sickness, but a case of positivity on a test. It's dishonest to call it a case when it's only a test. And the test, if it's very accurate in finding some of the nucleic acid or protein of the virus, it doesn't mean that you have reacted to the virus at all. And if you've reacted to it, it doesn't mean that you have had any sickness reaction at all. It simply means that the virus has been detected. And the people who are susceptible to getting sick from that sort of virus, this particular kind of coronavirus happens to attach to the ACE2 enzyme, which is a proteolytic enzyme that destroys angiotensin. And so if there is a huge amount of the enzyme, of the virus circulating, if you have reproduced it and there's a lot of it in your bloodstream, it will be inactivating the proteolytic enzyme that destroys the inflammatory angiotensin, so that the virus is capable of turning on your inflammatory system. Everything that angiotensin acts on will be released and intensified, and until you have the resources to turn off angiotensin, for example, progesterone and carbon dioxide will counteract the effects of angiotensin. And so the process of getting sick from coronavirus simply doesn't happen if you have the proper physiological response to increasing angiotensin, which is to increase your carbon dioxide and progesterone, turn off the inflammation at the base.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, if the tests are so inaccurate, like what you're saying is almost like a moot point, because nobody can know for sure if they even have this thing. Is that right? Or is that too much of a stretch?
No, it's okay to find out that you have the virus sitting on your nasal membranes or wherever, but if it's there and you haven't got sick, that's just the normal. 80% of the people don't bother getting sick when it's present because they have enough progesterone and carbon dioxide and not too much PUFA. Linoleic acid is required for the virus to take on its virulent shape.
Did you see the recent article in the British Medical Journal? It was more of an opinion, but actually an article as well, that showed, I guess 3 main points that really struck me. For me, that was the last nail in the coffin of the whole COVID thing. Number one, 20 to 50% of people have pre-existing immunity to that thing. So the whole thing about this being a novel virus, or maybe it is a novel virus, but the article says, look, it's so similar to other coronaviruses that just like the swine flu, which apparently also was discovered that most people have up to 60% have actually pre-existing immunity. now we're seeing 20 to 50% of people around the world have already pre-existing immunity to this virus. The other thing that the article noticed is that most of the people that had pre-existing immunity, they had no antibodies. So this means that the whole antibody test may be bogus in terms of determining immunity to this virus, which immediately made me think, hold on a second. Most of the flu vaccines and literally any vaccines against the virus, when they undergo clinical trials, they rely on the antibody test to say, oh, this vaccine is working. You're now immune to this virus. But this study is now saying, no, actually antibodies are really not very reliable. It's T-cell reactivity, which should be looked at, and almost nobody is looking at that because the tests are much more expensive. But it may turn out that we are immune to a majority of the viruses that are in circulation simply because they're so similar to each other. At least they're groups of viruses that we've all been exposed to, and we may have a significant pre-existing immunity to most of the viruses that are in circulation right now, even if they're slightly different from each other. What do you think of that?
That should stimulate a reconsideration of the whole 115 years of medical immunology theory, but I don't think it will. The whole history, starting with Paul Ehrlich and his lock and key thing, and equating his chemical toxins with antibodies, that whole thing is bogus. The real immune system is everything in the organism that makes it able to stay healthy in the presence of things that could possibly make it sick. But his mercury compounds, various organic chemical treatments that he equated to the lock and key antibody antigen reaction, that happens, but it isn't what makes us immune. It's a horrible chemical commercial ploy to sell products absolutely lacking science, which should start with cells such as T cells and all of the different white blood cell-like resident tissue cells, mast cells, dendritic cells, a whole range of things that don't produce antibodies but that are essential for maintaining good health. Those things are the real immune system, but to understand them, you have to understand the whole physiology, and it's easier to think in terms of lock and key and something you can buy from a pharmaceutical monopoly.
So as far as the antibodies, I also thought, there's something else here though. For some diseases that are viral, actually having a high antibody titer, it's a really bad sign. The hepatitis viruses and I think HIV are prime example. You don't want, it's a sign you may die soon if you have very high levels of antibodies. How did they manage to sell the fraud of certain viral diseases? It's good to have antibodies still, but for others it's not. Have they ever explained that publicly?
No, they don't like to talk about evidence unless it can be fitted into the lock and key idea. Progesterone is considered an immune suppressant, but
right.
That's because it limits our antibody production, where estrogen drives furious production of antibodies, but limits estrogen destroys our thymus if it's dominant. Progesterone can regenerate the thymus. What it's doing is reducing the potentially autoimmune anti-survival antibody system and promoting the thymocentric innate resistance system, reducing inflammation while allowing regeneration and restoration.
You just gave me a great insight, saying that estrogen increases the production of antibodies. As you well know, since estrogen is involved in many of the blood cancers like lymphomas, leukemias, etc., is it the high estrogen that's making these people that have these cancers very often have very high antibodies to viruses like the JC virus or the Epstein-Barr virus? It's really the high estrogen that's causing this, not the virus causing the leukemia.
Yeah, I think so. And lots of people get convinced that they have chronic Epstein-Barr problems. It's the estrogen driving their antibody-producing system wild, and what they need is progesterone. I've seen cases diagnosed as fairly serious, if not terminal, lupus, for example, clear up overnight or within a week of using progesterone, simply by restoring the balance between progesterone and estrogen, gets rid of that wild production of antibodies.
Are any other steroids that may have similar effect, like maybe cortisol, that increases the antibody production?
Well, it destroys the thymus type cell processes. It shrinks the thymus gland the way estrogen does. So it tends to leave the antibody system working.
I see.
Ray, maybe we could switch gears a little bit and maybe speculate about the end game of coronavirus. Like I've been watching a person's channel named Ice Age Farmer, and he's been documenting the destruction of like food warehouses and like just like telling farmers that they can't have cows or they have to kill their animals and things like that. And so he was basically pulling from the Rockefellers' own information that part of this renovation of society involved the renovation of the food system. And so I could go on here, but what do you think about that?
That fits perfectly and tightly, seamlessly with the digital money program that was tried out in India, killing lots of people. And I noticed that the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the World Economic Forum are now collaborating on changing India and all of Africa to digital money. And if that happens, you don't have to destroy the food supply to get it under total monopoly control. You'll have everyone's purchasing power under your central control. Simply turn off their bank account if they don't behave. You don't have to kill their cows.
Aren't they maybe kind of doing that in China already?
I haven't been investigating that. I don't know.
So the second thing I wanted to bring up was James Corbett put out a video called Coronavirus and Climate Change. And so, again, tying this into the old narrative, and James kind of comically says, it's silent, it's invisible, it's spreading everywhere, it's going to kill us all. We have to take extraordinary measures to combat it. Coronavirus? No, silly. It's carbon dioxide. And then Bill Gates on his blog, this was a little while ago, he said, COVID-19 is awful. Climate change could be worse. And so clearly the WHO and Gates and other people are just like kind of seeding this into the current narrative. Do you think that's going to take shape as in the form of the end game, like maybe climate lockdowns or something like that?
Yeah, they're getting away with a nonsense virus pandemic, and if people ever catch on that the whole thing is fraudulent, they'll have to come up with something new. So they could come back with an acute climate problem. Actually, they're blaming the fires on the Pacific coast on climate change, but the climate change is really being driven by the 100 years and more clear cutting, destroying the forests, which were the climate moderators. The forests were responsible for the moderate amount of rainfall that sustained those forests. When they clear cut them and at the same time began draining lakes and rivers into cities, the clear cutting destroyed the soil, started depleting the underground water, and that added to the clear cutting to destroy forests more quickly, dehydrating the whole region. And now the clear cutting has changed the climate, and the dryness itself is stimulating the spread of fires, which increases the destruction of vegetation. And it's a self-stimulating desertification process, but has nothing to do with carbon dioxide.
What do you think about the idea that the directed energy weapons are causing the fires?
In around 1970, when they were about to cut the last of the ancient forests, a few of tiny miniature forests were set aside from logging. But at the same time, the idea of salvage logging, if there was a forest fire, was introduced just within a year of setting aside these ancient forests. And as soon as that happened, arson, apparently, because it's really the only logical explanation for why forest fires suddenly started in these set-aside no logging areas. But with the new law, they could rush in, even before the fire was out, they could rush in and start cutting trees, even trees that weren't burned, justified by the fact that there was a fire. So arson, at least in some of the well-forested areas, has obviously been the cause of the fires. There are probably many causes. The government used to have lookouts who could see every part of the forested country, Washington, Oregon, and California, from mountaintops. The Forest Service is now renting those out for $80 or $100 a night to tourists because they don't have forest watchers. Now, the idea of fire watchers, the people who stand around evacuating populations in front of the fires, they're our current concept of fire watchers. They watch the fire burn rather than watching. The policy for 40 years or so was called the 10 a.m. policy. On the day following the sighting of a fire, that they had to have it out by 10 a.m. the following day. Now they watch it. Justified, the story was that the Indians used to preserve the forests by allowing controlled burns to get rid of the underbrush. But after 100 years of destroying the forests, they said, let's be ecological and have permissive forest fires. Let the fire burn. But what they have is these dehydrated, highly flammable, no longer native forests that create very destructive forest fires that are only valuable to the salvage loggers. So the policy now is let it burn. Our local fire started in one of these set-aside wilderness areas called the Opal Creek Wilderness. They knew it was burning for a month. It started August 16th, and it happened that huge winds came up after they'd been watching it burn in the wilderness area by this new policy. That allowed it to spread into these vast fires that have ruined the air for the whole western part of the U.S.
Well, I guess my question more like, do you expect these kind of targeted disasters that are going to be blamed on climate change to contribute to, like, what's the point of these disasters? Maybe if it's arson, are they trying to move people to a certain area? Are they trying to get them out of the suburbs or something? What do you your take?
The overall policy is to change the whole economy, get rid of any hint of self-sufficient economic activity, and turn everyone into a potential employee. Make room for useful eaters, and if someone chooses not to be useful in their system, then their fate probably isn't going to be much better than what the Nazis did with their useless eaters.
So to make people destitute, do you what are they going to do with all these people? Like, are they going to round them up in something? Or I know this is a dark subject, but what do you think?
There are thousands and thousands of homeless people in Portland and Eugene, and they've been herding them around, moving them in places that are less conspicuous, but not doing anything to help them, but keep them from being a nuisance or spectacle.
Well, I remember, wasn't there a storm in Texas, and they cleared out like Walmarts and kept people in there kind of against their will? Like, so stuff like that is probably in our future, or happening right now in Portland.
There will be more unemployed and homeless people as soon as the moratorium on foreclosures comes to an end.
Yeah.
I can't see any alternative except a huge expansion of the homeless population, and it's possible to survive living in a cardboard box with a plastic shield against the rain, but it isn't going to create a stable population. So within 20 years, it will have meant a reduction of the population.
Go ahead, Georgie.
Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, reducing the population and turning the useless eaters into useful eaters, what do you think that process would look like? Because right now, I guess a useless eater is a person who is self-sufficient, and they're trying to make him into useful eater, which means entirely dependent on the powers that be. Is that your usage of the word?
A cog in the wheel, whatever the machine is that they intend to have operating. I can't really visualize how they foresee this artificial intelligence guided society to be working 50 years from now.
But if we're moving more and more towards centralization and automation, even if you turn all of the useless eaters into useful eaters, these people are largely useless anyways, right? I mean, what are they going to do? They don't really have jobs for all these people.
I know that's why I can't foresee any viable future for the reset economy of the World Economic Forum. Now, most people are employed. Someone is making lots of profit for having billions of people making junk, useless electronic gadgets to keep the people occupied and wanting or being willing to work. As long as there's money to be extracted, this system is working, but it isn't self-sustaining. It requires constantly pumping resources in from the empire, and once Africa and South America have been mined to the limit, they're simply going to have to either rethink the whole program or eliminate vast amounts of the population. The whole imperial World Economic Forum program is currently based on the empire, and it's getting essentially free raw materials and extremely cheap labor to sell to anyone who has the money to buy it.
What about very rural areas? I mean, America is a large country, and while I could see the authorities rounding people up and roughing them up in I guess big cities and maybe suburbs, what about the great heartland in between? Do you think they'll just have the army sweep through the country and make sure that there's no rural areas where people are self-sufficient? Because if these people are left to their own devices, they'll figure out how to survive. They'll start a chicken farm or a goat farm or a cow farm. So I guess the empire must have some kind of a plan of preventing that or getting rid of it if people kind of take matters into their own hands.
They already have all of these levels of local, state, county, city government trained to be integrated with the military and the plans, the economic plans. All kinds of minor officials have been contacted by the Homeland Security to participate in their anti-terrorist programs and so on. So they're ready to deal with anyone who starts guerrilla chicken farms or potato farms or whatever.
They'll get ruby ridged.
So how are they gonna? I mean, let's say there are existing farms right now. I guess it's just me. I just have a hard time imagining that the local sheriff in rural Alabama will round up his deputies and start walking around and shooting people's chickens and cows and animals that are already existing, right? I mean, if these things already exist, there either has to be a program of getting rid of it in order to make people desperate, or these people will not be desperate. They'll continue, thriving on their own.
In the 30s, they did exactly that. They sent the military or police out to wipe out vast amounts of pigs and chickens and fruit and vegetables, destroying and burying huge amounts of food to increase the price of food, to start investment coming back.
Well,
and
go ahead.
That was done supposedly to get employment increasing, and it was actually the coming war that increased employment and stopped the depression. But they did it with a supposedly good intention of restoring the economy. But now they'll have other reasons for convincing any organized shooting capable force, state police or county police or whatever, to do the Ruby Ridge sort of thing, identify the independent co-ops as terrorist dangers.
And then they'll have pretext because the animals will have COVID-19, and so therefore the people will be harboring killer virus animals, and they'll be, like you said, like they'll be considered terrorists. And I'm sure there'll be a media campaign against these people as well if you're just like a homesteader.
Yeah, in the 1930s, while the government was doing that official destruction of resources, the corporations had their goons out, burning down alternative newspapers, burning out co-ops of various sorts, consumer co-ops and producer co-ops were they would last a few months and then they would be destroyed by corporate employees.
So do you think, like, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. There are some areas in the country that have extremely strong anti-government attitudes, including at the local law enforcement level. Some of these sheriffs, some of the state police, they seem to be much more, much more strongly tied to their local communities than to the federal or the state government. You don't think that some of these people, their loyalty may switch when they see what's going on, or do you think they have a way of forcing the local law enforcement to play ball?
At some point, the empire necessarily has to fail when it reaches the limit of what it can extract from the colonies, and when the empire totally fails, then we can expect intelligence to erupt in unexpected places, including such things as rural police.
Okay, but you're saying for now there's still, I guess they've been so indoctrinated due to the constant exchange of know-how and weapons with the military that I guess and I'm sure the federal government is putting a tremendous effort into making sure this continues, that most of the local law enforcement is sort of like heavily dependent for their jobs on the federal government, which uses this dependency to indoctrinate and provide weapons and whatnot in return for some sense of loyalty.
Yeah, and they're just very, very heavily indoctrinated with the ideology that the big economy has to be preserved.
Do you think China is also trying to be the next empire, or do you think they have a more different idea of for the future?
I think historically they would be satisfied to be self-sufficient, but they are historically very good business dealers, better than Trump at making deals, and so I think they're almost necessarily going to be a new economic empire, even if they don't have to enforce it with the military the way the U.S. has. They're already succeeding faster than the U.S. is, despite the U.S. having hundreds of military bases everywhere. Now they're in the process probably of setting up new colonies in Armenia and Azerbaijan, so that they've got Russia and China even more encircled than before with their colonized agents.
As they say, when the bank robber runs out of banks to rob, the bank robber's lifestyle necessarily has to suffer. Do you think we're getting to that point, or do you think there's still some leeway to go?
Yeah. It can go on for easily 10 or 15 years, but things get less and less stable. So I think the opportunity for opting out of the system, people are seeing the possibilities more and more.
Almost 2 hours, so maybe I can read these super chats, and maybe I can, and Georgie, ask questions if you have some, but maybe I can ask you just one question since it's on my mind. desiccated liver tablets have become extremely popular, Ray. And you wrote to somebody, desiccated liver contains oxidized tryptophan, cysteine, vitamin A, ubiquinone, and many other harmful things. Can you unpack that and maybe, I don't know, just talk a little bit more about that? Like, if somebody hates liver, is it harmful to eat those desiccated pills versus trying to make a pate or some other form of liver?
What you'll get will be a few B vitamins that are fairly stable and lots of iron and also lots of potentially irritating or toxic breakdown products of all of those highly oxidizable compounds. Vitamin A in the process of oxidizing can catalyze all kinds of attacks on surrounding materials. So oxidizing the vitamin A could destroy some of the otherwise stable B vitamins. So it's not really a very logical way to get your liver. Eggs have many of the same nutrients in a lower concentration, and so eggs would be the next best substitute rather than dehydrated liver.
Yeah, a lot of the carnivore people are like cashing out on desiccated liver. So like the beef liver, the freeze dried, that is the process you're talking about. Like that's what creates like the freeze dried. That's what creates all the harmful and the oxidized products. Is that right?
Yeah, if you carefully defat it to start with, get rid of ubiquinone and vitamin A and vitamin D and K and so on, some of the most useful things in the liver, then you can dehydrate it and have a good vitamin B complex, however, with lots of iron.
And speaking of iron, one last question for me, and then I'll read the super chat, or Georgie, if you had other few questions. But does the formation of gray hair always involve an excess of iron, or could that oxidative stress or reductive stress, could that be from some other instigator?
Radiation. I think people often get white whiskers where they've had dental x-rays just because the x-rays destroy so much of the apparatus. Iron probably goes into when iron is circulating in the body, it will probably settle into the damaged pigment-forming copper-containing enzymes that have lost their copper. So even though excess iron wasn't necessarily the cause of the whitening, it's likely to show up as a presence associated with the white hair. Sort of like in an area with toxic metals, you'll find aluminum in the Alzheimer's brain, but the aluminum gets there just because the Alzheimer's process normally would be from the buildup of calcium under stress and lactic acid production and so on. But if you're exposed to aluminum, it'll outcompete the calcium in some of the places. The same way with the iron, it isn't necessarily the cause, but it'll be associated with it very often.
Okay, with that, it's been 2 hours, so Ray, I'll let you go. Let me just read these names of the people that donated the super chats. Unfortunately, guys, I'd love to ask Ray all these questions, but we would just be on here for hours. So I told Ray I'd only keep him for 2 hours. So John Rowan for $10, thank you so much. Benji for $5, thank you so much. Marcelo for $20, thank you so much. Christina Tomaj for $24.99, thank you so much, Christina. XR for Australian $7.99, thank you so much. Michael for $100, thank you, Michael. Sincerely appreciate it for that. Right to Ray. Janet Pack for $200. Thank you so much. These are short. Michael says, thank you for inspiring the minds of Danny and Georgie. I think that was you, right? Janet says, thank you so much for taking the time to share all this knowledge. Were there any other ones I was getting? Okay, let me keep going here. Michelle for $50. Wow, thank you so much for your thought-provoking discourse. Thank you, Michelle. Harry Burgos for $25. Thank you so much, Harry. Kathleen Stewart for $49.99. Thank you so much, Kathleen. She says, thank you, Dr. Peat. And Helena for $20 Australian says, thank you, Danny. Thank you, Dr. Peat. Danny and Georgie, always interesting and informative listening. Okay, Ray, can you let everybody know how to subscribe to your newsletter?
Its address is Ray Peat's newsletter with the S at gmail.com.
And then the status of your books?
You can find that at the same address.
Okay, Georgie. Go ahead, Ray. Go ahead, Ray. I cut you off.
The books are all available digitally, but some are still available on paper.
And then what newsletter are you working on right now?
Lactic acid, pretty much the stuff we've been talking about tonight.
Nice. And Georgie, any parting words?
Not really. I had one more question for Ray if he has the time. Ray, are you familiar with quinine, the alkaloid present in tonic water, the one that gives it bitter taste?
Oh, I've tasted it, and I've read about how the FDA has been abusing it by turning it into a proprietary, super expensive drug instead of a natural herbal remedy. But I don't really know much about how it works.
The hydroxychloroquine, which is basically a synthetic derivative of quinine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is, well, first in regards to COVID, there's a recent study came out that showed that quinine was actually 10 times more effective without any cell toxicity in killing the COVID, the coronavirus, and both preventing the virus from entering the cell and stopping an already existing infection. So I thought that's pretty remarkable. And again, it shows how FDA can bastardize pretty much anything good that the world provides, just for the purpose of making money. But the reason I'm asking is that if you look further into quinine on PubMed, there are a number of pretty interesting studies showing that it depletes tryptophan similar to the way, actually it has similar effect to the drug phenclonine, parachlorophenylalanine. But instead of inhibiting the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, somehow the quinine is capable of depleting tryptophan inside of the cell and basically making it deficient in serotonin. And on top of that, apparently it's acting as similar to the drug cyproheptadine, and that also blocks the serotonin receptors. So I thought that those effects were remarkable because I don't know of any other chemical that has such effects. So I thought, I was wondering if you've seen anything, but if you haven't, that's fine.
That convinces me to try some tonic water.
Yes, me too. Apparently the British, when they were drinking tonic water while they were colonizing India, they were drinking tonic water that was not ruined by FDA's regulations. So it had a much higher amount of quinine. I think right now FDA limits it to about 85 milligrams per liter, while the British were drinking it in a concentration of 300 to 500 milligrams per liter, and they were guzzling this all day with no ill effects, it seems. They managed to conquer entire India and survive malaria and many other diseases.
Ray, I swear there's absolute last thing. I can't believe we didn't talk about this, but your 2-minute thoughts on Trump getting coronavirus.
No opinion whatsoever.
You don't think it's 4D chess or anything?
I'm not convinced that he even has anything. It would be politically opportune to get it, but I don't think it matters very much one way or the other.
Interesting.
It might take a little away from his, since he said he was using hydroxyquinone, it might deflate his publicity for it a little.
Awesome. We can talk about this a little bit more next time, as I'm sure this will develop. Guys, please give this episode a like. We do not show up in the search of YouTube. In fact, none of Ray, I did that food video and had your name in it. If you type in Ray Peat, the video doesn't even show up on YouTube search, which is just awesome. I love that. But anyways, Ray, thank you so much. It's always special having you on. I sincerely appreciate it. Georgie Dinkov, thank you so much, my partner in crime. Thank you, everybody listening. The audience of this show, although small, is extremely just interactive and always throwing out good ideas. So sincerely appreciate it. Engaged is the word I was looking for. Guys, thank you so much. Ray, have a safe time in Oregon, Eugene, right now. And Georgie, I'll talk to you soon. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Take care, everyone.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished
Victor Technologies, the high-flying hardware computer company which took a nosedive this year, may be bought out by the British firm Applied Computer Technologies. Piloting the space shuttle is very difficult to do, one would think. Can a kid or a normal person actually pull this off?
Well, what I did when I designed this was I understood that problem.
It seems the sweep of technology has no limits. In San Francisco this week, the world's first robot bartender was unveiled. The robot can talk, can take spoken orders, and can mix 200 different drinks. But on the first test run, the robot knocked a glass off the bar and onto the floor and poured beer all over the counter. The robot's designer said there were still some bugs to be worked out.
U.S. retaliation, nuclear war, nuclear war.
In Japan, where high technology is showcased, consumers stare in wonder at the latest facet of life overtaken by the computer age, the department store. But while the Cebu store is proud of its technology, it is worried that customers will feel it has lost the human touch.
me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished with
Victor Technologies, the high-flying hardware computer company which took a nosedive this year, may be bought out by the British firm Applied Computer Technologies. Piloting the space shuttle is very difficult to do, one would think. Can a kid or a normal person actually pull this off?